They called it the Flying Barrel. Spring 1943, and German pilots saw it coming across occupied European skies like nothing they'd encountered before. Massive radial engine jutting forward, thick fuselage that looked better suited for hauling freight than fighting, stubby wings that seemed incapable of the quick turns that kept men alive in combat. Veterans who'd been killing since 1939 laughed at these ungainly American machines. They flew sleek, agile fighters, designed by the world's finest aeronautical engineers. Within months, that laughter would die in their throats. What replaced it was something colder. Respect, then fear, then a desperate acknowledgement that the Americans had brought something entirely new to the war. Not a machine built for elegance, but for destruction. Not for demonstration, but for survival. Not for individual glory, but for industrial victory. The transformation took 11 months. When it ended, 86,000 targets lay destroyed across Europe. This is the story of how the Flying Barrel became the weapon that dismantled the Third Reich. May 6, 1941, Farmingdale, New York. Test pilot Lowry Brabham climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft unlike anything the United States Army Air Forces had ever commissioned. The Republic Aviation Corporation's newest fighter prototype sat on the runway like a tank that had sprouted wings. 8 tons at maximum takeoff weight, more than twice the weight of most contemporary fighters. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian immigrant who served as Republic's chief designer, had created something unprecedented. When combat reports from Europe in 1940 reached his desk, they described a brutal new reality. Pilots needed altitude performance above 30,000 feet. They needed firepower to destroy increasingly armored aircraft. They needed durability to survive the new generation of heavy machine guns and cannons that filled European skies. Kartveli threw out conventional wisdom entirely. Instead of pursuing agility and lightness, he designed for power and strength. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing 2,000 horsepower, became the heart of his design. Mounting such power created challenges that defined the aircraft's appearance. The turbo supercharger system required extensive ducting through the belly, giving the P-47 its distinctive barrel shape. Not an aesthetic choice, an engineering necessity. The armament exceeded anything previously mounted on an American fighter. 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Total ammunition load of 3,400 rounds. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they delivered a weight of fire greater than any American fighter in history. Brabham released the brakes and advanced the throttle. The massive radial roared to full power. The Thunderbolt accelerated down the runway, heavy but purposeful. At 75 miles per hour, he pulled back on the stick. The prototype lifted off smoothly despite its weight, climbing through 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000. At 30,000 feet, where most fighters gasped for air, the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger came into its element. The engine maintained full power. Brabham pushed the nose down into a dive. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, 450, approaching 500. The controls remained responsive, the airframe solid. When he landed 45 minutes later, his report confirmed what Kartveli suspected. They had created something revolutionary. Not the most agile fighter, not the longest ranged, but potentially the most survivable and heavily armed fighter aircraft in the world. June 1942. Bridgeport, Connecticut. The 56th Fighter Group began receiving their first P-47 Thunderbolts. Pilots transitioning from lighter fighters experienced immediate culture shock. Captain Robert Johnson, who would become one of America's leading aces, later recalled his first impression with brutal honesty. "I thought they delivered a medium bomber by mistake." The cockpit sat 9 feet above the ground. Pilots needed a ladder to climb in. Forward visibility on the ground was so limited that crew chiefs had to guide pilots during taxi. Fully loaded, the aircraft weighed 14,000 pounds, 7 tons of fighter that made tarmac groan under its weight. But once airborne, pilots discovered unexpected qualities. The cockpit was spacious, a luxury in combat aircraft. The controls, while heavy, moved in harmony with the aircraft's mass. The P-47 didn't dance through the sky like a German Bf-109. It dominated through raw power and energy. Colonel Hubert Zemke took command of the 56th Fighter Group in January 1943. Zemke had served as a combat observer with the Royal Air Force. In 1940, he understood aerial warfare against the Luftwaffe intimately, and he recognized immediately that the Thunderbolt required different tactics than lighter fighters used. German pilots had mastered turning combat at medium and low altitudes. Their fighters could outturn almost anything in the European sky, but the P-47 had advantages they couldn't match at high altitude. Zemke developed the boom and zoom tactic that would define Thunderbolt combat doctrine. Climb to 30,000 feet or higher. Use superior high-altitude performance to gain energy and positional advantage. Dive on enemy formations at speeds approaching or exceeding 500 miles per hour. Fire the devastating 8-gun armament. Use dive speed to escape before enemies could respond. Climb back to altitude and repeat. Energy fighting in its purest form. The Thunderbolt couldn't turn with German fighters, but it could outdive them, outclimb them at altitude, and absorb damage that would destroy any other fighter. April 13th, 1943. The 56th Fighter Group flew their first combat mission from Horsham St. Faith Airfield in England. The Thunderbolts rendezvoused with a formation of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses at 25,000 feet over the English Channel. The bomber stream stretched for miles, hundreds of four-engine aircraft heading toward targets in occupied Europe. German radar stations tracked their approach. Luftwaffe fighter units scrambled from airfields across northern France and Belgium. The first interceptions came near the Belgian coast. Messerschmitt Bf-109S and Focke-Wulf FW-190. Fighters climbed to meet the Americans. German pilots had developed tactics over 3 years of war. They knew how to exploit weaknesses in bomber formations. They understood escort fighter capabilities and limitations. What they didn't fully understand yet was the Thunderbolt. Over the next 3 months, Luftwaffe fighter units encountered Thunderbolts with increasing frequency. Each engagement reinforced the same pattern. American pilots refused turning combat. They fought from altitude using speed and dive performance, and their aircraft absorbed punishment that would have destroyed German fighters. June 26, 1943, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying P-47D serial number 226490, nicknamed All Hell, encountered the reality that would make the Thunderbolt legendary. Johnson had escorted bombers deep into Germany. As he turned for home, low on fuel, a flight of German fighters caught him alone. What followed became one of the most documented survival stories of the air war. German fighters attacked repeatedly, firing hundreds of rounds into Johnson's aircraft. His canopy jammed shut. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen. Control cables severed. The fuselage became a sieve of bullet holes. Johnson counted over 200 impacts after landing. His wingman had been shot down. He was alone, crippled, 200 miles from safety. But the Pratt & Whitney R2800 kept running. The thick aluminum skin and redundant control systems kept the aircraft flyable. Johnson nursed the battered Thunderbolt across occupied Europe, unable to bail out due to the jammed canopy, fighting to maintain altitude with damaged controls. Focke-Wulf FW-190 pulled alongside. The German pilot stared at the shattered Thunderbolt, clearly visible through the bullet-riddled fuselage. He could see Johnson in the cockpit, wounded but conscious. For a long moment, the two pilots flew formation. Then the German pilot saluted, a gesture of respect for a doomed man, and rolled away without firing. No German fighter could have survived what he saw. The pilot must have believed Johnson would crash within minutes. Johnson made it back to England. Ground crews counted 210 bullet and cannon shell impacts. The fuselage looked like scrap metal ready for salvage, but after 3 weeks of repair, all hell returned to combat. Word of Johnson's survival spread through both American and German squadrons. For American pilots, it proved the Thunderbolt's legendary toughness. For German pilots, it raised disturbing questions. What kind of aircraft could absorb such damage and keep flying? What did this say about American engineering capability? October 8, 1943, Major Hans Philipp, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 confirmed victories, led his fighter wing on an interception mission. Philipp embodied the Luftwaffe's elite. He'd flown over 500 combat missions. He held the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest decorations. He was considered nearly invincible. At 30,000 feet over Germany, his formation encountered Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group. The Americans had altitude advantage. Philipp's engine began losing power in the thin air. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, designed for combat below 25,000 feet, struggled at this altitude. The Thunderbolts dove. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying the same aircraft that had survived the June attack, led his flight into firing position. His combat report was brief. Saw hits along the body. Aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. Hans Philipp, the ace who had survived 500 missions, died in seconds. The psychological impact rippled through Luftwaffe squadrons. If Philipp couldn't survive against these American fighters, what hope did average pilots have? The flying barrel, once mocked, had killed one of Germany's finest. By autumn 1943, American tactics had fully evolved. Thunderbolt pilots no longer engaged in turning fights. They used altitude and speed as weapons. German pilots found themselves forced into defensive postures, unable to reach the Americans at 30,000 feet, unable to escape when Thunderbolts dove from above. The P-47's weaknesses remained. Range was limited. The massive radial engine consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Early models could escort bombers only to the German border before turning back. But engineers addressed this systematically. 75-gallon drop tanks extended range. 108-gallon paper tanks pushed it further. By April 1944, wing pylons plumbed for fuel allowed 425-mile combat radius. Still not enough to reach Berlin. That mission would fall to the longer-range North American P-51 Mustang. But for targets within range, the Thunderbolt excelled. And as 1944 began, American strategists identified a new mission that would play to the Thunderbolt's greatest strengths. January 1944, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force began planning. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Air superiority over the invasion beaches was absolute requirement. But beyond air superiority, planners needed something more. They needed systematic destruction of German transportation infrastructure. Every railroad, every bridge, every supply depot, every troop concentration. Ground attack missions that would expose aircraft to murderous anti-aircraft fire. The P-47 Thunderbolt was built for this mission. Its radial engine, with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, could sustain damage that would destroy an inline engine. Lose 2 or 3 cylinders and the engine kept running. Its thick aluminum skin could absorb 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft shells and remain airborne. Its straight wing design provided stability for dive bombing and strafing, and its .850 caliber machine guns could shred anything on the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group pioneered low-level attack tactics. In March 1944, Duncan, a rangy Texan with an aggressive temperament, convinced commanders to authorize operational evaluation of the Thunderbolt as a fast, low-level strafer. The results exceeded expectations. Thunderbolts could dive from altitude, attack at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, absorb defensive fire, and climb back to safety. By April to 1944, all 9th Air Force P-47 groups had transitioned to the fighter bomber role. They practiced dive bombing with 500 and 1,000-pound bombs. They mastered the M8 4.5-inch rocket. They perfected strafing techniques with the 8-gun armament. They became ground attack specialists while maintaining air combat capability. As D-Day approached, Thunderbolts spread destruction across northern France. Railroad marshalling yards burned. Bridges collapsed. Supply convoys exploded on roads. Airfields became unusable, cratered moonscapes. German commanders recognized the threat. Anti-aircraft defenses intensified. 88mm flak batteries positioned around critical infrastructure. Lighter 20mm and 37mm guns protected convoys. Thunderbolt losses increased, but the ratio remained favorable. For every 100 sorties, less than one aircraft was lost. The rugged construction that had saved Robert Johnson now saved hundreds of other pilots. Aircraft returned with engines missing cylinders, with control surfaces shredded, with hydraulic systems destroyed, with fuel tanks punctured, and they kept flying. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Operation Overlord commenced with the largest amphibious invasion in history. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties. Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force provided close air support for troops landing on the beaches. They attacked German strongpoints. They interdicted roads to prevent reinforcements from reaching the coast. The Luftwaffe appeared briefly, overwhelmed and ineffective. Years of attrition had ground down German fighter strength. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal training. Fuel shortages, limited flight hours, and everywhere German forces moved, Thunderbolts appeared overhead. The systematic destruction of transportation infrastructure paid dividends. German armored divisions took days to move distances they could have covered in hours. Supply convoys traveled at night, hiding from aircraft during daylight. Railroad transportation became suicidal. Pilots developed intimate familiarity with the French road network. They coordinated with ground forces via radio. Tank commanders could call for air support and describe targets with precision. Thunderbolt pilots would appear overhead within minutes, identify the target, and attack. July 29, 1944. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy. German forces trapped between advancing American armored divisions attempted to escape. The 405th Fighter Group caught them on the road. From 3:10 in the afternoon until 9:40 in the evening, Thunderbolts attacked in relays, bombs, rockets, strafing runs with 8-gun armament. When ground forces reached the site the next morning, they found devastation beyond comprehension. Dozens of tanks destroyed, hundreds of vehicles, artillery pieces scattered along miles of road. The systematic destruction made retreat impossible. This became the pattern across France. German forces attempting to retreat faced systematic destruction from the air. Oberleutnant Joseph Priller, a Luftwaffe ace, who had initially questioned the Thunderbolt's effectiveness in early 1943, watched his forces destroyed from the air. After the war, he admitted his error with brutal honesty. "We laughed at them in 1943. Nobody laughs now." Statistics compiled after the war revealed the scale of destruction. From D-Day on June 6, 1944, until victory in Europe Day on May 8, 1945, a period of 11 months, P-47 Thunderbolts destroyed or damaged 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. 86,000 targets in 11 months. Think of it differently. 7,800 targets destroyed per month. 258 targets per day. Every single day for 11 months. 10 targets per hour around the clock. A constant grinding destruction of enemy capability. The Germans called it flying barrel. They meant it as mockery. But history remembers it as one of the aircraft that won World War II. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Germany launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, a surprise offensive through Belgium. Weather conditions prevented aerial reconnaissance. Entire German armored divisions assembled under cover of clouds and fog. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise, creating a bulge in Allied lines. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest land battle in which the United States Army participated. Weather remained terrible. Low clouds, snow, fog, conditions that grounded aircraft. For days, German forces advanced while Allied air power sat on the ground. But when the weather cleared on December 23rd, the Luftwaffe learned what total air superiority meant. Thunderbolt flights patrolled the front lines constantly. They discovered German columns attempting to move supplies and reinforcements. They attacked every opportunity. The Luftwaffe attempted one final blow. On January 1st, 1945, nearly 1,000 German fighters and bombers launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise strike against Allied airfields. They achieved surprise, destroying over 200 Allied aircraft on the ground. But the losses were replaceable. American industry produced aircraft faster than combat could destroy them. German losses in Bodenplatte, over 200 aircraft and nearly 300 pilots, were irreplaceable. The operation broke the Luftwaffe's back. By late January 1945, German resistance in the Ardennes collapsed. Thunderbolts returned to their systematic destruction of German infrastructure. Every bridge, every marshalling yard, every supply depot, the grinding campaign continued. April 1945, Allied forces drove deep into Germany. The end was near, but Thunderbolt pilots still flew daily missions. Lieutenant Raymond Knight volunteered repeatedly to lead attacks on enemy airfields. On April 24th and 25th, he flew into intense ground fire on low-altitude reconnaissance and strafing missions. His aggressiveness destroyed numerous German aircraft on the ground. But on April the 25th, ground fire struck his aircraft during a strafing run. The Thunderbolt crashed. Knight died in the impact. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of two P-47 pilots to receive the nation's highest decoration. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe ended. Final statistics revealed the Thunderbolt's impact. Over 746,000 sorties of all types. An aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. Over 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. A loss rate of 0.7% per mission. Remarkably low for the intensity of operations. 15,680. 3 P-47s were built between 1941 and 1945. More P-47s were produced than any other American fighter in history. The sheer scale demonstrated American industrial capacity. But numbers alone don't capture the Thunderbolt's significance. The aircraft represented a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy. Previous fighters emphasized agility, speed, lightweight construction. The Thunderbolt emphasized firepower, durability, survivability. It accepted weight in exchange for protection. It sacrificed some maneuverability for devastating armament. It prioritized bringing pilots home over achieving maximum performance. This philosophy reflected American strategic thinking. The United States could build thousands of fighters. It could train thousands of pilots. But every pilot saved, every aircraft that returned despite damage, multiplied combat effectiveness. A pilot who survived his first tour could fly a second tour. An aircraft that landed despite battle damage could be repaired and returned to combat. German fighters, elegant and high-performing, were often fragile. A single hit in the cooling system of a Bf-109's inline engine meant forced landing. American pilots in Thunderbolts often could nurse crippled aircraft home. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Knowing the enemy aircraft could absorb incredible punishment while their own fighters couldn't, created constant stress. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Baer, who survived the war with 220 confirmed victories, summarized German respect for the Thunderbolt with brutal honesty. The P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. Coming from a pilot who had fought for 6 years, who had flown against every Allied fighter type, who was among the Luftwaffe's most skilled survivors, this assessment carried weight. The transformation of German attitudes was complete. From mockery in April 1943 to fearful respect by 1945. From dismissive nickname of Flying Barrel to acknowledgement as the perfect fighter bomber. The aircraft that looked like a barrel had proven that combat effectiveness came not from elegant lines, but from brutal capability. After the war ended, Thunderbolts continued serving. The 56th Fighter Group, which flew Thunderbolts throughout the war, claimed 677.5 aerial victories and 311 ground kills. They were the only 8th Air Force unit that refused to transition to P-51 Mustangs, preferring to keep their Thunderbolts. Their loyalty to the aircraft spoke to pilot confidence in the design. Colonel Francis Gabreski, who became the leading American ace in the European theater with 28 confirmed victories, all in P-47s, later reflected on the aircraft. He noted its spacious cockpit, its reliability, its ability to bring pilots home. He acknowledged it wasn't the fastest or most agile fighter, but in his assessment, it was the best fighter-bomber of the war. The few surviving Thunderbolts became treasured warbirds. When a restored Thunderbolt takes off today, the sound of the R-2800 radial engine at full power remains unmistakable, a deep, thundering roar that echoes the aircraft's name. Modern air forces studied the Thunderbolt's design, philosophy, the Fairchild, Republic. A 10 Thunderbolt II, designed in the 1970s for close air support, explicitly honored the P-47's legacy in its name. The A-10, nicknamed Warthog, embodies the same principles: heavy armament, armor protection, survivability over performance, ability to absorb damage and keep flying. The historical record is clear. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not the most beautiful fighter of World War II. It was not the fastest or the most agile, but measured by combat effectiveness, by pilot survival rates, by sheer destructive capability, by the transformation of enemy respect from mockery to fear, the Thunderbolt stands among the greatest fighters ever built. 86,000 targets destroyed in 11 months. Railroad cars, locomotives, armored vehicles, trucks, the systematic dismantling of German military logistics, the grinding destruction of an enemy's ability to move, to supply, to fight. 68,000 trucks destroyed. Every truck represented supplies that never reached the front. 9,000 locomotives destroyed. Every destroyed locomotive meant trains that couldn't run, supplies stacked at marshalling yards, reinforcements delayed. 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed. Every destroyed vehicle meant reduced combat power. 86,000 railroad cars destroyed. Each could carry tons of supplies. Multiply by 86,000, and the total represents millions of tons of supplies that never reached German forces. Food, ammunition, fuel, equipment, all destroyed before it could be used. These numbers represented conservative estimates. Actual destruction exceeded documented figures. But even conservative numbers told an undeniable story. American industrial capacity, translated into combat aircraft, translated into pilot training, translated into tactical doctrine, had achieved systematic destruction of enemy military infrastructure. The flying barrel, mocked and dismissed in 1943, had become the instrument of German military logistics destruction by 1945. Captain Priller, who radioed that the Americans were flying barrels in April 1943, survived the war. He never flew combat again after 1944, wounded in action. In post-war interviews, he acknowledged his initial assessment was wrong. The flying barrels had proven to be among the most effective combat aircraft of the war. Their ugly, ungainly appearance concealed devastating capability. The transformation of the nickname itself tells the story. Flying barrel began as mockery, a dismissive comment from experienced pilots who judged aircraft by appearance. But as German forces retreated across Europe under constant aerial attack, as supply lines burned, as every movement invited destruction from above, the nickname took on different meaning. The flying barrel became something to fear. In the final accounting, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stands as one of history's most effective combat aircraft, not because it was the best at any single measure of performance, but because it was superbly effective at the missions it flew, because it brought pilots home alive, because it destroyed enemy capabilities systematically and relentlessly, because it transformed from a mocked flying barrel into a feared instrument of destruction. The lesson extended beyond World War II. Aircraft design involved trade-offs. The Thunderbolt's designers chose firepower and survivability, over agility and range. This choice proved correct for the missions the aircraft ultimately flew. Ground attack required durability more than maneuverability. Survivability mattered more than maximum speed. Fighter pilots learned that tactics mattered as much as aircraft performance. Zemke's boom and zoom doctrine allowed Thunderbolt pilots to exploit their aircraft's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. Energy fighting at a high altitude negated German turning advantages. This tactical innovation transformed the Thunderbolt from a mediocre turning fighter into a devastating energy fighter. The barrel that looked wrong flew right when it mattered most. The aircraft, built like a tank, proved tougher than any tank when battle damage came. The fighter dismissed as too heavy became too tough to kill. And for 11 months of brutal European war, it ground the Third Reich's ability to move, to supply, to fight, into dust and wreckage scattered across 1,000 miles of roads and rail lines. The flying barrel, history's most unlikely devastator, the ugly machine that won through brutal effectiveness what elegant designs could not accomplish through beauty. Long after the guns fell silent, the lesson remained. Sometimes the weapon that looks least like a weapon proves most effective at war. Sometimes what looks like a barrel full of mistakes is actually precision engineering wrapped in practical steel. Sometimes the mockery transforms into the legend. The Thunderbolt proved all of this. 8 tons of fighter that shouldn't have worked, but it did, devastatingly.